My son Daniel informed me that he did not want me to attend his wedding because his fiancé's family believed I was not affluent enough, so I took revenge by cancelling his event. I, 49F, have been a single mother to my son, 27M, and have raised him on my own since his birth. My spouse, regrettably, died when I was pregnant with him. He had an aneurysm in his sleep, and when I awoke, he was gone. Since then, I've raised Daniel on my own and made significant sacrifices, as other single parents can relate. I'm not suggesting he owes me anything because I'm his mother, but some recognition would be good. Unfortunately, he informed me a few weeks ago that he did not want me to attend his wedding because apparently, according to his fiancée Sarah and her family, I did not appear wealthy enough to fit in with the type of people who would be present, which was extremely hurtful. So I did something quite underhanded, which is not in my nature, but I couldn't stop myself. All of this started 3 years ago when he first began dating Sarah. I believe he met her through friends, and she comes from an affluent family. Her parents operate one of the state's top real estate corporations and are extremely wealthy. She also looks the part, dressing in expensive brands from head to toe and owning 3 cars. Because I am only a community college economics professor, I clearly appear to be a peasant. I do make a reasonable amount of money, which has been sufficient for me and my son because it has allowed me to pay all of the bills and mortgages while still affording to raise him single-handedly the past 20. It used to be good enough for us until he started dating Sarah, at which point things began to change and became uncomfortable between us. For the record, I never had any issues with his relationship with Sarah or with her as a person until recent. Even though we met for the first time, my son subsequently called to tell me that I needed to start changing things about my house to make it appear better. He had mentioned that the fact that much of the furniture in my house looked quite old made him feel embarrassed because he had been to Sarah's parents' estate and seen how lovely and gleaming everything was. So he urged me to make an effort to improve the appearance of my home. We had a fight after that first meeting because I didn't think there was anything wrong with the way my house looked, and the fact that some things were really old merely added character. I didn't want Sarah's or her parents' flashy, glamorous lifestyles because I knew I couldn't afford them, and I wanted to live modestly. I was totally content with my life and had no problems, so he had no right to complain about it too, because some of the things he wanted me to replace, such as furniture and other items, had actually been chosen by my late husband, and I cherished them. So we had a quarrel back then, and I told him that if he was embarrassed by me, he should not have introduced me to his wealthy girlfriend in the first place. Then he realized he was being a jerk and apologized to me later, and we were able to patch things up. But after that, he never brought Sarah over to my house, and I only saw her a few times. I met her parents once, when they got engaged, and I went to the party. Even so, my son had a lot to say about how I was dressed, claiming that it was an engagement party and that I should have made more of an effort. However, I believe I was properly dressed. I'm not stupid. I could see his true issue was that I wasn't dressed in premium brands and was instead wearing clothes that I could buy, but I believe he was too afraid to say it. Anyway, I tried not to mind, and despite the fact that he had become increasingly distant from me after introducing Sarah to me, I continued to try to communicate with him. But then, 5 days ago, he paid me a visit and told me that after Sarah and her parents met me at the engagement party, they didn't think I'd fit in with the crowd at their wedding because it would mostly be their friends and other business associates who worked with their parents, but none of his family members. Because Sarah's parents were supporting the majority of, he decided it would be best if he followed their desires. He even mentioned that he would have a private ceremony later on and that I would be invited, but for the time being, he simply wanted me to understand where he was coming from, since he did not want me to feel out of place. I was quite wounded when he said that, and I began crying, but he became irritated and stated that there was nothing worth crying about because I did not appear wealthy enough to get in there, and he did not want me to humiliate myself or him. He explained that he had believed I would understand, but that I was being selfish by not worrying about his image in front of his in-laws. Once I finished crying, I told him to leave my house and never return. He attempted to argue, but I simply screamed at him and asked him to go. After that, I was still upset, so I decided to do something I'm not sure was the best decision. So, a few weeks ago, I assisted him in securing the site for his wedding. When I called to check in on him a few weeks ago, he said he was having trouble deciding on a venue. Apparently, the spot he wanted was something Sarah had in mind, and it was not one of the homes that their wedding planners had shown them, but it was a really gorgeous place a little outside of the city. However, the owner refused to rent it out and would not allow them to marry there. He had been negotiating with this individual and Sarah's parents for ages, but he refused to give it up no matter how much money they offered him, and Sarah Sarah was just as stubborn. She had refused to consider any other location, and now there were only a few weeks till the wedding, and they had even sent out invitations with that address written on them at Sarah's request. But they hadn't been able to finalize the location and were still negotiating with the owner. When he told me the owner's name, I realized I knew him. I remembered that I had gone to college with this guy, and I immediately thought that maybe I could help him out, but I wanted it to be a surprise, so I simply apologized and hoped that things would work out for him somehow. But then I decided to contact this guy in some way, and after speaking with him for a couple of days, I realized that the reason he was unwilling to rent out his property for any events was because he and his wife were concerned that if they allowed events to be held there, the people hosting would trash the place, which had happened a couple of times before. They did not want this to happen, and they wanted to maintain their property's natural beauty. But I informed him that we were talking about my son, and since he knew me personally, I could assure him that none of this would happen. Furthermore, Sarah's parents owned the top real estate agency, so he didn't have to worry about the home being wrecked. It took some convincing, but after a few days, he consented to speak with my son. I also persuaded him not to divulge my name because I planned to tell them about it after the wedding and surprise them myself. Anyway, once I convinced him, he consented, and my son was overjoyed. He had no idea I was behind any of this, which is why he was so sure when he told me I wasn't welcome at the wedding. Anyway, I was really hurt after he paid me for that visit, so I decided to call the owner of the property and explain what had just happened. I did not plan to overshare, but I was so distraught that I ended up telling him everything, and he actually had to comfort me despite the fact that we are not very close. But he and his wife were really nice to me and said they were going to back out of the deal since they didn't want to deal with such an ungrateful person. I thanked them, and the next day they told me that they had returned the money they had collected in advance and notified my son and Sarah that they would no longer be able to rent out their property to them, so they needed to go elsewhere. Sarah's parents were supposedly furious and threatened to sue them, but they stated that they didn't care about anything. There were still 2 weeks until the wedding, and the papers they had signed clearly stated that they were perfectly within their rights to cancel up to 1 week before the event was scheduled to take place, so they couldn't exactly sue them on any legal grounds because they had followed the contract. It's not their fault they didn't get their lawyer to read the fine print quickly, so they no longer had a venue, and I felt very vindicated, enough so that I decided to write it all out in a letter and give it to my kid. It was a petty act, I admit, but he had hurt me a lot over the last 6 months, and I couldn't take it longer, so I detailed everything in my letter, and instead of sending it, I went to his house that evening, knocked on the door, and left the note on the threshold before driving home. To ensure that he couldn't contact me again, I blocked him as soon as I got into the car. Later that night, he paid me another visit, but this time he appeared much more apologetic. He told me that he had come over as soon as he finished reading the letter and was here to apologize because he had no idea I had secured that venue. He was literally crying, apologizing for how he had treated. He had no idea how much it would hurt me, but now he had spoken with Sarah, and she was also upset, so he needed me to speak with the owner and resolve the situation for him because there were only 2 weeks until the wedding, and all of the invitations with the venue's address had already been sent out, so they really needed my help at this point. He began pleading with me to assist him, but I told him that the way he had been treating me for the past few months since he began dating Sarah had been completely unacceptable, and the things he had said were extremely hurtful, so I don't think I wanted anything to do with him after that. I thought I'd raised a good man, but he was quite shallow and chose to side with his fiancée and her parents over his mother. I told him that I had made many sacrifices for him since he was a child, and that all I expected in return was for him to be grateful to me. But he had made it very obvious that he was humiliated and embarrassed by me, and he did not want to claim me as his family, simply because his fiancée and her parents were against it and embarrassed by me. He stated that he would take it all back, speak with Sarah and her parents, and have them apologize to me as well. But for the time being, he only wanted me to contact the owner and resolve the matter so that they could marry at the previously chosen site. I informed him that I had already spoken with the owner and that I wasn't going to keep bothering, so they had to find out how to deal with this on their own because I couldn't help them in any way. Then he became angry and told me that I was being unreasonable right now, so I told him he had to leave because I couldn't help him. I was pretty adamant at the time, but he just seemed to give up and told me that I was free to do whatever I wanted. But if I didn't help him out this time, I was going to lose him forever because he had never thought of me as a vindictive person. But clearly, I was being extremely selfish, and he was tired of having to balance these two because it was putting so much pressure on him. He told me he couldn't keep up with the balancing, but Sarah would understand. He claimed that he was fatigued and finished with it. Then he departed, and I've been worrying about whether I made the right decision. So I'm here to inquire if I'm the bad guy for refusing to help my son reclaim his wedding venue. Update #1. Hello. It's been a a month since I last spoke with my kid, and I still haven't contacted the venue's owner to resolve any issues. I was torn about what I needed to do, but now I see clearly. I was simply being a sentimental fool, but I've thought things through, and my son is big enough to handle this on his own. Besides, I don't think I could persuade the owner to change their thoughts after what I told them, because they appeared to be set in their decision. I've spoken with a number of my friends and relatives, and I've explained the entire issue to them, as many family members were startled that he was getting married, but they hadn't received an invitation. So I told them the actual reason he wasn't asking us. He was ashamed of his family and didn't think we'd fit in with the crowd his fiancée and her parents had invited. People were really offended, and when I told them what I had done with the venue and everything, they appeared to believe it was a reasonable reaction on my part. Also, my son hasn't bothered to communicate with me since the previous time he left, and we didn't exactly end the conversation on a positive note. If he truly believed that this was significant, he would have sought out me again. There are only a few days until the wedding. I'm not sure what they'll do because they've already printed the venue's address on the invitations, but I know it's no longer my problem because if he doesn't want to invite me to his wedding and consider me family, it also means that I've been absolved of my responsibilities as his mother. So I'm still trying to digest this emotionally because it's been difficult because as a single mother, all I've ever had was my son. But in my head, I've made a decision that I intend to keep. Update #2. Hello, so there are only 6 days until the wedding, and I had given up hope that my son would contact me, but Sarah did today. It surprised me that she would ask to speak with me, because I felt she and her family did not want me at their wedding in the first place, so why would she expect me to want to talk to her? But when she called, I got a gut feeling and answered the phone. I was quite cold to her, but on the other end, I could hear her trying not to cry as she spoke to me, saying that she knew I had a terrible fallout with my son, but she just needed one chance to speak to me and urge me to make things right. She said some bizarre things, like she knew I didn't like her and that we hadn't gotten off to a good start, but she still respected and admired me, so she wanted me to speak with the venue's owner and try to resolve the matter, despite the fact that she was aware that I was currently fighting with her fiancé. She stated that my son had allegedly prevented her from speaking with me about anything, but she wanted me to know that she was really unhappy when she learned that I would not be attending the wedding. That was strange, and I snapped at her, telling her that she didn't need to put on an act with me because I knew she was the one who had told my son that she and her family didn't think I'd fit in at the wedding, which is why I hadn't been invited, and my son had turned against me because of it. There was stillness on the other end for a few minutes before she went on to say that neither she nor her parents had said anything like that, and there must have been some misunderstanding. After that, both of us were perplexed, and I reiterated that this was exactly what my kid told. She, on the other hand, said that she had not said such a thing and that my son had informed her that I was the one who had declined to come because I obviously did not like her and did not approve of her family since I thought they were arrogant and snobbish. After we had swapped stories, we realized that my son had been feeding us both a bunch of lies because, in all likelihood, he was the one who was embarrassed and was throwing Sarah and her family under the bus in order to avoid having to invite me to the wedding and show everyone there that he did not exactly belong in there. I recognized what was going on, and my brain really started spinning, so I told Sarah that I'd call her back later to go over the detail. But for now, I just needed a break. After about half an hour, once I had processed this, I called her back and we discussed it further. I told her everything that had transpired since the beginning, including how my son had always made it appear like she and her family had a problem with me, but she maintained that she had never said any of it, and neither had her parents. She explained that my son had always given the impression that I disliked them, which is why she had kept her distance from me. Even when he decided not to invite me to the wedding, he had said something else to me, which you are all aware of. But he had told Sarah that I was the one who was not interested in attending because I did not approve of her, and he had actually told her that he would no longer contact me, so she needed to respect that as well. That was why she had never bothered to talk to me about it before today. I was devastated to find that these things were happening because of my son, not his partner. Since at least while I believed Sarah and her family were responsible for everything, I could forgive my son, even if only slightly, since I knew he was under the influence of someone else. But now that I know he did it entirely on his own, I can't forgive him. After chatting with Sarah, we were both disappointed, and she informed me she had nothing else to say to him. We ended the call after apologizing for the misconceptions. It's been a few hours since then, and I'm just sitting in one position, unsure what to do. I'm confident that after learning all of this, she will cancel her wedding, which is great for her. She deserves better, and so do I. Unfortunately, I cannot find a better son for myself. This is all I have, and every time I think about how much I've done for him and what he's done to me, my heart starts to throb even more. I'm very sure he'll contact me after this, since he'll be able to tell me that Sarah and I discussed everything, and we both know the truth. Given nowhere else to go, I'm sure he'll return home. But given what he's done, I believe he has forfeited the right to call my house his home and me his mother. Update #3. Hello! Since yesterday's post, I've been grieving the loss of my son. He's still alive, but I know I've lost him. And even if he returns, I won't take him back. At least not until I've dealt with this emotionally on my own. But I predicted that with nowhere to go, he'd return home, which is exactly what happened today. I assumed that once Sarah discovered the truth, she would confront him about the issue, and that is exactly what happened. A few hours ago, around early evening, someone began furiously ringing my doorbell, and when I realized who it was, I opted not to open the door because it was obviously my kid. I spoke to him over the intercom and told him to go because, after everything he had done, this home no longer had a place for him. I could see he had a number of bags behind him, and he looked exhausted. His face was all splotchy as it would be after crying, but I didn't let that break my determination, and I simply ignored it. When he told me he came here to apologize to me and correct his mistakes, I could hear the desperation in his voice, and it was tough not to respond, but I just tuned him out. I could hear him remark that Sarah had kicked him out after their fight, and he knew we were both aware of everything at this point. He kept talking about how difficult it had been for him to acclimate to Sarah's environment, and how, in the process of doing so, he had begun to act like someone he was not. He was very sorry that he had been embarrassed by me, his family, and where he came from, but it was all very new to him at first, and after a while he got used to pretending, and he became so engrossed in the act that he forgot that I was not a part of it, which was hurting me. He said that he was selfish, and definitely did not deserve either of our forgiveness, but he really wanted a shot with me since I was his mother, and would be more forgiving than his girlfriend. At that point, I informed him that I would have been more forgiving if he had genuinely apologized. But he was just sorry that he had been discovered in all of his falsehoods. He was sorry because he needed a place to stay and didn't want to spend money living in a hotel or finding a place of his own. But he wasn't sorry for what had happened since, if he was, he wouldn't be trying to justify his action. He would simply apologize, own his mistakes, and let them go. But he'd stated how tough things had been for him, at least 5 times since he arrived. So I didn't believe he was truly sorry. I told him that I might forgive him later. I'm not sure yet. But for now, I simply wanted him to leave me alone. He then began bartering with me, stating that he would be prepared to pay rent to stay with me, but he only wanted to return and make things right with me. He even claimed that he was saying this sincerely, because if he wanted to, he could have lived with his buddies. But I knew he was lying because, according to Sarah, he hadn't even bothered to invite a large number of his friends to the wedding. So, in all probability, they were not on speaking terms with him right now, which is why he was so desperate to live with me. Anyway, after a while of arguing with him, he shouted at me, saying that I was just as callous as before, and then walked away. I'm confident he won't be homeless. He has enough resources and means to live on his own for a few weeks, and then he can just locate an apartment for himself. My duty as a mother is complete. All I had to do was raise him to be a nice human being, and he was a good person for a while, but that is no longer my responsibility. Update #4. Hello. So it's been 3 weeks since my last update, and on the day my son was going to marry, Sarah just posted that she and my son had split up, and she asked everyone to respect her privacy during this terrible time. Several people forwarded me that post, and I felt horrible, but not enough to reach out to my kid and console him. After that last day, when he showed up at my place and I refused to let him in, he stopped contacting me, so I believe I was correct in what I said. He was only sad because he had been discovered, and he knew that no one else would even consider speaking to him again. But I had decided to turn my back on him, and he had not contacted me to apologize. So I think he's fine with maintaining no touch, as am I. I've been living on my own for a few years now, so what difference does it make to be fully alone? And it's not like I'm lonely. I have friends, family, and a life. My son will not be a part of it anymore. That is it. Maybe I'll find it in myself to forgive him one day, but that's not going to happen soon, and that's fine with me.